The people of Dry Creek always remembered the price before they remembered the girl. $40 in worn silver coins, an old Winchester rifle with a cracked wooden stock, and a stubborn bay mule that limped whenever the weather turned cold. That was all it took to decide the future of 23-year-old Evelyn Harper in the Colorado Territory during the bitter autumn of 1879. The men inside the trading post barely looked up from their whiskey when the bargain was made. To them, it was only another deal in a hard country where survival mattered more than kindness. Evelyn stood quietly near the cold stone fireplace, refusing to let anyone see the fear clawing through her chest. She had spent her whole life learning that tears solved nothing on the frontier. They only froze before they ever reached the ground. Outside, the wind pushed sheets of dry snow across the empty street, making the lonely settlement look almost abandoned. The mountains surrounding Dry Creek stood like giant walls against the gray sky. Everyone said a man named Gideon Mercer lived somewhere beyond those peaks where the forests grew thick, and the winters never truly ended. Some called him a trapper. Others called him a ghost. Most simply called him the mountain bear, because no one had ever seen him back away from anything living. Evelyn expected the worst. She expected another cruel master. She expected another prison. Instead, she found herself staring at a man who never once looked at her like she belonged to him. The trading post smelled of pine smoke, damp leather, and spilled whiskey. Shelves lined the rough log walls, stacked with sacks of flour, iron tools, lantern oil, and boxes of ammunition. A few ranch hands warmed themselves beside the fire, pretending not to watch what was happening. Beside Evelyn stood her older cousin, Mason Harper. After both of Evelyn's parents died from fever 3 years earlier, Mason inherited the family cabin along with responsibility for her. Responsibility, however, had always felt like a burden to him. Gambling came easier than honest work, and by the time winter approached, he owed money to men who collected debts with bullets instead of words. "I need 60, Mason muttered nervously. The tall man standing across from him didn't answer immediately. He simply studied Mason with calm blue eyes that looked as cold as the mountain lakes after the first snowfall. His name was Gideon Mercer. He was well past 50, broad-shouldered, with silver beginning to cover his thick brown beard. A long scar crossed one side of his face from his temple down beneath his jaw. His heavy buffalo-hide coat carried the scent of cedar smoke and pine sap. Snow rested across his wide hat as though he had walked through the storm without noticing it. Finally, Gideon spoke. 40. His voice was deep and steady. The Winchester on my horse, the mule outside. Mason swallowed. He knew he should refuse. He also knew the men waiting for their money would likely kill him before sunrise if he walked away empty-handed. He reached for the leather pouch Gideon tossed onto the counter. The silver coins clinked heavily inside. Without looking once at Evelyn, Mason stuffed the pouch beneath his coat. Done. He hurried toward the door. For one brief second, Evelyn believed he might stop. She believed he might remember she was family. He never slowed his pace. The heavy door slammed behind him, leaving only the sound of the wind. Evelyn remained where she stood. Her world had become strangely quiet. Every promise anyone had ever made her had disappeared with the man walking away into the snow. She waited for Gideon to grab her arm. She waited for rough hands. She waited for the commands she had heard men bark at women all her life. None came. Instead, Gideon walked over carrying a folded wool blanket. You've only got that dress. She looked down at her faded blue dress, patched countless times around the sleeves. Yes. He handed her the blanket. Wrap yourself. She blinked in surprise. You'll freeze before we reach the ridge. That was all he said. Then he walked outside. Evelyn stood frozen for another moment before slowly wrapping the thick blanket around her shoulders. It was warm. Warmer than anything she had worn in months. She followed him into the storm. A large chestnut horse waited beside the hitching rail while a smaller mare stood quietly beside it. Gideon tightened the saddle straps on the mare before handing Evelyn the reins. She knows the trail better than either of us. Evelyn climbed carefully into the saddle. Neither of them spoke as they left Dry Creek behind. The road disappeared beneath fresh snow within the first mile. By afternoon, they had entered the foothills where towering pine trees blocked most of the week's sunlight. The air became colder with every step upward. The wind carried sharp pieces of ice that stung Evelyn's cheeks. She tried hiding the trembling in her hands. She refused to complain. Every man she had known believed weakness deserved punishment. She expected Gideon to believe the same. Hours passed. The mountains grew steeper. Dark cliffs rose above them, while frozen streams twisted through narrow valleys below. The trail eventually narrowed, until only one horse could pass safely at a time. Evelyn's mare slipped slightly on loose ice. Her heart jumped. Before she could lose her balance, Gideon reached back, caught the bridle, and steadied the frightened horse. "You all right?" She nodded. "You don't have to pretend." His voice remained calm. The mountain already knows when someone's scared. He released the bridle and continued leading the way. Evelyn watched him carefully. There was no anger, no impatience, only quiet experience. As evening approached, the snowstorm became fierce. The wind roared through the canyon, so loudly that neither of them could hear their own horses breathing. Visibility shrank until the world became nothing but white. Gideon suddenly stopped. He climbed off his horse and walked back toward her. Evelyn's pulse raced. This had to be the moment. There was nobody else for miles. No witnesses. No help. Gideon quietly removed his heavy buffalo hide coat. Before she could speak, he placed it around her shoulders. The enormous coat nearly covered her completely. Warmth surrounded her instantly. She stared at him in disbelief. "What about you?" He adjusted the blanket around her neck. "I've spent 30 winters up here." He smiled faintly. "You haven't." Then he climbed back onto his horse, wearing nothing but a thick wool shirt. Evelyn could barely believe what had happened. No man had ever chosen discomfort so she could stay warm. The simple kindness unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. The ride continued for another hour before the trees finally opened. Ahead stood a sturdy log cabin built directly against the side of a granite cliff. Smoke drifted steadily from its stone chimney. Stacks of chopped firewood stood beneath a wooden shelter. Animal hides hung drying beside a small smokehouse. Everything looked neat. Everything looked cared for. This wasn't the lonely shack she had imagined. It looked like someone had spent years building a real home. Gideon climbed down and secured both horses before helping Evelyn off the mare. Her legs nearly collapsed beneath her. The long ride and freezing cold had drained every bit of strength she possessed. Gideon caught her gently by the elbow before she fell. "Easy." His grip was strong enough to lift a wagon wheel, yet careful enough not to hurt her. He pointed toward the cabin. "Go inside." Evelyn pushed open the heavy wooden door. Heat rushed over her face. The smell of burning cedar filled the room. She stopped in surprise. The cabin was spotless. Cast iron pots hung neatly above a massive stone fireplace. Bundles of dried herbs lined the ceiling beams. Shelves held carefully stacked jars of preserves, sacks of flour, and folded blankets. A wide bed covered with thick quilts stood in one corner. Near the door rested a narrow wooden cot with a single worn blanket. Nothing was wasted. Everything had its place. Gideon carried their supplies inside before kneeling beside the fire. Within moments, fresh logs crackled brightly across the hearth. He filled a kettle with water and placed it over the flames. "Sit by the fire." Evelyn obeyed. She watched him quietly prepare supper without speaking. Soon he placed a bowl of venison stew and fresh bread on the table before her. He poured hot coffee into a tin cup. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. She tried eating slowly. Within minutes, the bowl was empty. Gideon didn't comment. He simply nodded once before eating his own meal in silence. Outside, the wind screamed against the cabin walls. Night settled over the mountains. Evelyn's stomach tightened. She knew what usually happened after a woman was purchased. She had seen enough suffering to understand exactly what men expected. Slowly she stood. Without speaking, she walked toward the large bed. Her shaking fingers reached for the buttons of her dress. She closed her eyes. She prepared herself to endure whatever came next. Heavy footsteps crossed the cabin. They stopped behind her. She held her breath. Then something soft landed in her hands. She opened her eyes. It was a thick wool night blanket. Gideon stood beside the fireplace, looking away from her. "The fire burns low before dawn," he said quietly. "It gets cold enough to freeze a person." He pointed toward the bed. "Sleep there." Evelyn stared at him. "But where will you sleep?" Gideon walked toward the narrow cot beside the door. "Right here." He pulled the worn blanket across the cot before sitting down. "You'll be warmer over there." He reached toward the lantern. "Blow out the light when you're ready." Evelyn remained standing, unable to understand the man before her. Everything she believed about the world no longer made sense. For the first time since losing her parents, she climbed into a bed without fear of what the night would bring. Outside, the mountain howled beneath another storm. Inside, the strange old mountain man slept beside the door, leaving the safest place in the cabin for the woman everyone believed he had bought. Winter settled over the Elkstone Mountains with a stubborn grip that refused to loosen. By the middle of December, snow buried the cabin almost to the roofline. The narrow trail they had followed from Dry Creek disappeared beneath layers of ice, cutting them off from the rest of the territory. The outside world no longer mattered. Every sunrise became another test of survival. Without anyone asking, Evelyn found her place inside the cabin. She woke before daylight each morning to stir the fire back to life, while Gideon hauled fresh wood from the shed before the bitter wind could steal the warmth from the room. She kneaded bread, repaired torn blankets, and learned how to dry meat above slow-burning hickory smoke. Gideon trapped beaver along the frozen creek, hunted elk higher in the mountains, and checked his lines before darkness returned. They spoke little, not because either disliked conversation. Silence simply belonged to the mountains. As the weeks passed, Evelyn noticed things about Gideon that no one in Dry Creek could ever have known. Every evening before supper, he brushed the horses until their coats shined despite the freezing weather. He always fed the animals before eating himself. Whenever he chopped firewood, he stacked every log perfectly straight without leaving a single piece scattered in the snow. Nothing about him matched the frightening stories people had whispered back in town. One afternoon, a blizzard trapped them indoors. The wind screamed so fiercely that loose snow forced itself through tiny cracks between the cabin logs. Gideon sat near the fire sharpening his hunting knife while Evelyn tried mending one of his heavy gloves. The stiff leather was thicker than anything she had sewn before. Her fingers finally slipped. The needle drove deep into her thumb. She gasped quietly. A single drop of blood landed on the leather. Without saying a word, Gideon stood, crossed the room, and opened a small wooden cabinet above the fireplace. He returned holding a tiny tin container. "Use this." Evelyn opened it. Inside was a smooth mixture made from pine resin, beeswax, and bear fat. "It'll keep the skin from cracking." She rubbed the salve across her dry hands. Within moments, the burning eased. She looked toward him. "You made this?" He nodded. "My mother taught me years ago." The answer surprised her. She had never heard him mention family before. Curiosity overcame caution. What happened to them? For several seconds, only the wind answered. Finally, Gideon rested the sharpening stone beside the hearth. My wife died 21 years ago. Evelyn looked up slowly. I didn't know. There wasn't much reason for anyone else to know. He stared quietly into the fire. Scarlet fever took her. His voice remained steady, but the sadness behind it was impossible to hide. Our little boy followed her 3 days later. The room suddenly felt smaller. I'm sorry. He nodded once. After that, I came back to the mountains. Neither of them spoke again for a long time. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt respectful. That evening, Gideon carved something from a piece of cedar, while Evelyn prepared supper. When he finished, he placed the small object beside her plate. She picked it up. It was a beautifully carved wooden comb decorated with tiny mountain flowers along the handle. She smiled before she could stop herself. It's beautiful. Your hair keeps catching on your shawl. He looked almost embarrassed after saying it. She gently ran the comb through her long chestnut hair. No one had ever made something simply because they thought she might need it. That small gift stayed beside her bed from that day forward. January arrived colder than either of them could remember. The frozen creek became solid enough to walk across. One bright morning, Gideon carried his Winchester outside. Evelyn watched him from the doorway. You know how to shoot? A little. My father showed me once. Gideon looked toward the distant tree line. That's not enough. He handed her the rifle. If you're staying here, you need to know it properly. He walked 50 yards through the snow before placing an old tin pan against a fallen pine. That's your target. Evelyn lifted the rifle. It felt heavier than she remembered. Gideon stepped beside her. Don't fight the rifle. He gently adjusted her shoulder. Let it settle. She inhaled slowly. Her finger squeezed the trigger. The rifle exploded. The recoil nearly knocked her backwards. She missed the target by several feet. You blinked. His voice remained calm. Again. They stayed outside until sunset. Her shoulder became bruised. Her hands ached. Her ears rang from the repeated gunfire. But by the final shot, the old tin pan swung wildly from a clean hit directly through its center. Gideon walked over to inspect it. He turned back toward her. A faint smile appeared beneath his beard. That'll do. It was the closest thing to praise she had ever heard from him. Over the following weeks, Evelyn carried the Winchester whenever she gathered firewood or checked the animal traps near the cabin. She no longer feared its weight. She respected it. Late one freezing night, the horses suddenly exploded into frightened whinnies outside. The mule kicked violently against the stable wall. Gideon was already awake. Wolf! He grabbed his lantern and shotgun. Stay inside. He disappeared into the darkness. Evelyn waited exactly 3 seconds. Then she reached for the Winchester. Snow swirled across the clearing as she stepped outside. The freezing wind stole her breath. She rounded the corner of the stable just as a huge gray wolf sprang from the shadows. It wasn't charging her. It was lunging toward Gideon. He had slipped on hidden ice while trying to protect the horses. The shotgun had fallen beyond his reach. Everything happened in a heartbeat. The wolf leaped. Evelyn lifted the Winchester. She remembered every lesson. Don't rush. Don't jerk the trigger. Breathe. She squeezed. The rifle thundered across the mountain. The wolf dropped only a few feet from Gideon. Silence returned almost instantly. Gideon slowly climbed to his feet. He looked at the dead animal. Then he looked at Evelyn. Without speaking, he walked over and lowered the rifle barrel with one gentle hand. "You listened?" She nodded, still shaking. "I was terrified." "So was I." The words caught her completely off guard. "You?" He looked toward the horses. "If you'd missed." He never finished the sentence. Instead, he placed his heavy coat around her shoulders and led her back toward the cabin. That night, neither of them slept much. Spring finally arrived in violent bursts. Melting snow flooded the valleys, turning every trail into deep mud. For the first time in months, Gideon prepared to travel down the mountain for supplies hidden inside a cave several miles away. Before leaving, he stood beside the cabin door. "Keep it barred." "I will. If anyone comes." "I know." She rested one hand on the Winchester. He gave one slow nod before disappearing into the forest. Hours passed peacefully. Evelyn spent the morning baking bread. By afternoon, she heard horses. 3 of them. Her stomach tightened. She quietly moved toward the window. 3 strangers rode into the clearing. Their clothes were filthy. Their saddles carried rifles. Their faces carried the hard look of men who survived by stealing from others. The leader guided his horse closer. "We're looking for shelter." His smile never reached his eyes. Evelyn remained hidden. "We've got food if you're willing to trade." Still, she said nothing. One of the men laughed. "I reckon there's a woman inside." The second rider pulled a revolver from his belt. "Let's stop asking." Before he reached the porch, a familiar voice echoed from the trees. "That's far enough." Gideon stepped into the clearing carrying his shotgun. He had returned early. The strangers turned toward him. The leader smiled. "Old man, move aside. This mountain's private." The leader laughed. "Says who?" "Me." The outlaw slowly raised his rifle. Before either man could fire, another shot cracked across the clearing. The outlaw's hat flew from his head as Evelyn's bullet tore through the brim, missing him by less than an inch. She worked the rifle's lever. Another cartridge slid into place with a sharp metallic click. "Next one won't miss." Her voice echoed through the valley. The 3 strangers looked from Gideon to the cabin. They suddenly realized they were trapped between 2 rifles. The leader cursed beneath his breath. He slowly lowered his weapon. "We're leaving." "You'd best." Gideon never moved. The outlaws wheeled their horses around and disappeared down the trail. Only after they vanished did Gideon walk toward the cabin. Evelyn opened the door. For the first time since arriving on the mountain, she saw pride in his eyes. "You kept your head." "I remembered what you taught me." He looked at the Winchester resting in her hands. Then at her. "You saved both of us today." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the last snow of winter melted beneath the afternoon sun. Inside the cabin, something much deeper had quietly begun to change between them, though neither one was ready to admit it aloud. Spring slowly gave way to summer, and the lonely mountain no longer felt like a place of exile. Wildflowers covered the open meadows with bright colors, the creek ran clear through smooth rocks, and every morning the cabin filled with the smell of fresh bread, pine smoke, and strong coffee. What had begun as a bargain for survival had quietly become a partnership neither Gideon nor Evelyn could have imagined during that cold day in Dry Creek. Their days settled into a peaceful rhythm. Gideon repaired fences, gathered timber, and checked his trap lines before sunrise. Evelyn planted a small vegetable garden beside the cabin, collected herbs from the hillsides, and learned how to tan hides until they felt as soft as cloth. They rarely needed many words. A glance was enough to understand what the other needed. Every evening they sat together on the small porch overlooking the valley. Sometimes Gideon carved wooden bowls while Evelyn stitched blankets from worn pieces of cloth. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt like home. One evening, as the sunset painted the mountains with gold and crimson light, Evelyn looked across the valley. "I never thought I could be happy here." Gideon rested his carving knife on the bench. "I never thought I'd have company again." She smiled softly. "I suppose we were both wrong." He nodded. "I reckon we were." Neither realized those simple words carried more meaning than any grand declaration ever could. By late August, smoke began rising from the southern forests. Wildfire. The dry summer had turned every fallen pine needle into fuel. The smell reached the cabin before sunrise. Gideon stepped onto the porch and studied the distant ridge. The smoke wasn't moving away. It was coming toward them. "We've got work to do." There was no panic in his voice, only calm determination. Together they cleared brush around the cabin, hauled buckets of water from the creek, soaked blankets, and covered the stable roof with wet hides. Every hour the sky grew darker until the afternoon looked like evening. Ash drifted through the air like black snow. The wind suddenly changed. Flames appeared across the western ridge. Trees exploded one after another as the fire raced downhill. Evelyn looked toward Gideon. "We can't stop that." "No." He handed her the Winchester. "But we can save this place." For hours they fought sparks landing on the roof. The heat became unbearable. Smoke burned their lungs. More than once Evelyn thought they would lose everything. Then, just as the flames reached the creek, thunder rolled across the mountains. Dark clouds gathered overhead. Rained. Heavy rain. Within minutes the fire slowed. Steam rose from the soaked forest while smoke drifted into the evening sky. The danger had passed. Evelyn sat heavily on the porch, completely exhausted. Gideon lowered himself beside her. Neither spoke. They simply watched the rain wash the mountain clean. After a long silence, Gideon finally smiled. "Looks like the mountain wanted us to stay." A few weeks later, the first travelers arrived after hearing about the wildfire. Among them was Sheriff Owen Carter from the town of Red Hollow. He removed his hat respectfully as he approached the cabin. "Folks in town have been talking." Gideon frowned slightly. "About what?" "The fire." The sheriff smiled. "They also mentioned an old mountain man living with a young woman." Evelyn stood beside Gideon without saying anything. The sheriff looked between them. "I wanted to make sure everything here was proper." Before Gideon could answer, Evelyn stepped forward. "It is." The sheriff studied her face carefully. "Miss, are you here by your own choice?" She answered without hesitation. "I've never made a freer choice in my life." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Then I wish you both well." He tipped his hat and rode away. Gideon watched until the riders disappeared. "I would have explained." "You didn't need to." She looked at him with complete confidence. "I know exactly where I belong." Autumn returned to the mountains with cool mornings and golden leaves. Nearly a year had passed since Evelyn first rode through the snow beside the quiet mountain man everyone feared. One afternoon, Gideon disappeared into the woods after breakfast. He returned carrying several long cedar boards. For 3 days, he worked beside the cabin without saying what he was building. Finally, on the 4th evening, he called Evelyn outside. Beside the porch stood a small wooden swing overlooking the valley. Every piece had been carved by hand. Tiny mountain flowers decorated the arms. On the top beam he had carved 2 simple words. "Home always." Evelyn ran her fingers across the smooth wood. "You made this." Gideon nodded. "I figured after all you've done, you deserved a proper place to watch the sunsets." She felt tears filling her eyes. No expensive gift anyone could have bought would ever mean as much as the hours he had quietly spent building it. She sat down on the swing. It rocked gently. "It's perfect." Gideon looked unusually nervous. There was something else. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small cloth bundle. Inside rested 2 plain silver rings. Nothing fancy. No jewels. Only polished silver. "I don't have speeches." He looked almost embarrassed. "I'm not much for fancy words." Evelyn smiled through her tears. "I've noticed." He took a slow breath. "I can't promise easy days." "I know. I can't promise riches. I don't need them. I can only promise that as long as I've got strength enough to stand, you'll never face another winter alone." For several seconds, Evelyn couldn't speak. Then she gently took one of the rings. "I wasn't looking for a perfect life." She looked into his weathered blue eyes. "I was looking for a safe one." She slipped the ring onto his finger. "You gave me that the very first night." Gideon's hands trembled slightly as he placed the second ring onto hers. There was no preacher. No crowded church. No audience. Only 2 people standing beneath endless mountains, with the wind carrying the scent of pine through the valley. It was enough. Winter returned exactly as it always had. Snow covered the cabin roof. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. Inside, the fire burned brightly. The same narrow cot still stood beside the door, but it was no longer used. Instead, Gideon had turned it into a bench for storing blankets. The large bed in the corner now belonged to both of them. One cold December evening, Evelyn sat near the fireplace, knitting a tiny wool blanket. Gideon noticed its unusual size. He looked up. "That one's awfully small." She smiled quietly. "It isn't for us." His forehead creased with confusion. She reached for his rough hand and gently placed it against her stomach. For a long moment, he simply stared at her. Then the meaning finally reached him. His eyes filled with tears. The strong mountain man who had faced blizzards, wolves, hunger, and loneliness without fear suddenly couldn't find a single word. Evelyn laughed softly. "I think that's the first time I've ever seen you speechless." He wrapped both arms around her with unbelievable gentleness. "I never thought I'd have another family." "You do now." Months later, when spring sunlight returned to the mountains once again, the cries of a healthy baby boy echoed through the little cabin. Gideon stood beside the bed, holding his son with hands that had once carried rifles, axes, and trap chains. Those same hands now held something far more precious. He looked toward Evelyn. "You rewrote my whole life." She smiled warmly. "No." She reached over and took his hand. "We rewrote it together." The people in the nearby settlements would eventually stop talking about the young woman who had been traded for a handful of silver and an old rifle. Instead, they spoke about the family living high in the Elkstone Mountains. Travelers always found a warm meal waiting at their cabin. Lost hunters were never turned away. Children who passed through remembered the kind woman with the bright smile and the quiet old mountain man who carved wooden toys, while pretending not to enjoy their laughter. Years later, no one remembered the bargain made inside the trading post. They remembered something far greater. A frightened young woman had been treated with dignity when the world expected cruelty. A lonely mountain man had opened his home without asking for love in return. And together they proved that the strongest foundations in the Wild West were never built with money, fear, or force. They were built with trust, respect, quiet sacrifice, and the courage to choose each other every single day.